Hey everyone, welcome to my super authentic indoor campsite. Pull up a chair, grab a drink. I've got Campfire story number 3 for you tonight. In honour of tonight's story, which is about a chef that leaves his celebrated restaurant after losing a Michelin star, I've got a slightly fancier drink, a Frangelico and lime in my hipster mason jar. So enjoy. Let's get started. This is called The Prodigal Son. It was a dreary day in late March as Jean-Paul Duval sat at the highly polished pine bar, anxiously awaiting the post. He absent-mindedly sipped his pastis as he looked over the broad balcony to the snow-covered mountaintops beyond. He'd been looking at this view since he was a baby, toddling through his father's kitchen under the rushing feet of sous chefs and busboys. Most days back then began with looking up at the mountains, not down on them. He remembered the feeling of the cool soil beneath his bare feet as he watched his mother tending to the gardens in the impossibly green valley that furnished ingredients for the celebrated restaurant. Ancient walnut trees provided shade to goats that were kept for their milk and their meat. Bees hummed lazily between hives and vegetable patches, their ponderous flight belying their industrious role of pollinators and creators of the sweet, floral honey that would be drizzled over creamy, biting cheeses. Each morning, he and his mother would load the day's harvest into their old Citroën van. Enormous courgettes, armfuls of fragrant rosemary, tomatoes heavy with sour sweet juice, and make the bumpy, winding drive to the little mountain hamlet where Chez Duval sat, nestled cosily in the hard granite arms of the mountains, proudly surveying the valley below. Jean-Paul liked to tell his customers that the view cleansed his soul and made his heart feel pure like a child. Today, though, the jagged peaks looked flatter and more sullen, their majesty a tilted and shabby crown in the grey light of the late spring afternoon. At last he heard the door of the postman's van slam shut. He clapped his drink on the bar and hurried to the front door. He breathed deeply. This was it. Marco, the ancient postman, who knew the mountains and their people better than anyone, handed Jean-Paul the letter and waited, his weathered brown hands clasped in front of him. The chef turned the envelope over in his hands. On the front left corner, a friendly cartoon figure smiled and waved at him, almost mocking the importance of this letter to the future of Chez Duval. With quivering hands, Jean-Paul ripped it open and scanned the contents. Marco could wait no longer. Et alors? He prompted. Well? Jean-Paul shook his head. Non. The letter congratulated Jean-Paul Duval, owner and head chef of Chez Duval, Saint-Gervais, on his award of a coveted Michelin star, the recognition sought by chefs the world over. What it really meant, though, was that an anonymous reviewer from Guide Michelin had taken away the second star that the restaurant had earned while his universally beloved father had been at the helm. Lucien Duval had raised this quaint alpine bistro from a quiet favourite of local skiers and hikers to a globally renowned hotspot, with international diners booking months in advance to sample the dynamic chef's take on traditional Rhône-Alpes cuisine, while basking in the exceptional views of Mont Blanc and the snowy peaks that divided France from Italy. In reality, Jean-Paul had been head chef for years, but it was only since Lucien had passed away last year that it had been his own name on the shingle, so to speak. And now, under his stewardship, the restaurant had suffered the greatest ignominy imaginable. He was a failure. He was ruined. Closing the door on the gaping postman, he returned to the bar, downed his pastis in one gulp, and poured himself another, building the courage to read the full letter from the publishers of the guide that made and broke reputations worldwide. In addition to the hollow congratulations on his one-star award, the letter included the review that was to appear in this year's edition of the guide. It read, A fine example of regionally influenced haute cuisine, Chez Duval remains a southern French favourite. Recently taken over by the fourth generation Duval, the new owner-chef demonstrates the familial prowess gained under his father's tutelage, but may lack some of the artistic flair of his forebears. That said, the boudin noir, a blood sausage of wild boar on a bed of wilted garlic shard, is simply transcendent, and there is no poor choice on a menu that is a love letter to stunning alpine environment in which the restaurant is situated. Indeed, to say the setting of this restaurant is extraordinary is an understatement, although some diners may find the alpine decor somewhat dated, and the full-bodied paysan fare may not suit the palates of urban Epicureans. Duval hung his head, awash with shame. He had followed in the footsteps of his ancestors, but instead of continuing their proud tradition, he had brought humiliation to his family name. Many chefs had taken their own lives rather than bear such a black mark. He should simply close down, leave Saint-Gervais, never to return. He could start a new life somewhere he wasn't known, somewhere that matched his ignominy, his fall from grace. Somewhere like Florida or Blackpool. He quickly drained his pastis, washing down the bile that had suddenly surged up his gullet. But in thinking of the decayed English seaside town, where he had once had to spend a summer eating greasy fish and chips at the feet of a prickly-legged aunt, an idea struck him. Watson. Watson may be his only hope. Philippe Watson-Jones was an English-French architect who claimed to be an exiled descendant of the Habsburgs, although no one seemed to be able to prove that. He had built a career for himself as a bridge between moneyed English families and the continent, designing lavish second homes from the Dordogne to Chamonix. Most of his clients came with the prefix of Lord, Viscount or Dame, and he referred nearly all of them to Chez Duval. Jean-Paul reached behind the bar, wobbling slightly on his stool, and pulled out the old fixed-line phone, the only device that would work reliably this far from a satellite tower. He punched in the Monte Carlo number and held his breath as it rang. 3 days later, the sun had finally broken apart the low clouds, bringing with it the first mountain wildflowers and the energetic emergence of marmots from their burrows. The architect and the chef sat on the balcony at Chez Duval, an expanse of white paper stretched between them. Philippe Watson-Jones was a petite man, with a shock of bright white curly hair that grew directly upward from his high forehead. On this particular occasion he was dressed in a black cashmere turtleneck and, as it wasn't particularly warm in the high alpine, a purple velvet smoking jacket, over which was draped a hand-woven Nepalese Angora scarf in a bold shade of green. He adjusted the thick turtle-shell frames of his glasses, which kept slipping down his long aquiline nose. "What you need, JP," he said, with his supremely confident Etonian inflection, "is a complete do-over. I mean, something really radical. This..." Here he waved his hand dismissively at the quaint alpine architecture behind him. "Sound of Music effect you have going on. It's sweet, but it's had its day, don't you think? Sophisticated diners are going to find it all a bit of a pastiche. It's time to shake things up, no?" Duval hesitated. His great-grandfather had built the steep-roofed cabin by hand, lovingly carving alpine pasque flowers into the eaves because they were his young bride's favourite. "JP," urged Philippe, "can I be brutally honest? It's a miracle you got the 2 stars at all with this structure. It's charming, really it is, but you probably got lucky with an ancient reviewer who loves this sort of thing. Modern critics are looking to see something totally new. We're all so bored these days. People are desperate to be surprised, shocked out of their stupor." He yawned pointedly and, studiously ignoring his client, began to sketch an angular edifice jutting precariously over the craggy rocks of the valley. Duval sighed. "Time marches on, I suppose," he thought to himself. "You can't stop progress." "How much?" Watson looked up from his sketch, trying unsuccessfully not to look pleased. "Oh, I'd say about 5, give or take. Maybe 8, given the complexity of the site." €8 million. Christ. He would have to mortgage his home, perhaps sell the little valley farm. But what price dignity? As the last bearer of the Duval name, was he not obligated to restore honour to his family and all that they had built? Slowly, he nodded. He would do it, on one condition: that Watson remain in the little hamlet to oversee the build, while he, Duval, packed his bags to seek the inspiration he needed to elevate his mountain peasant cuisine to the standards expected by the world's glitterati. Philippe Watson-Jones frowned. He was accustomed to splitting his time between London and Monaco. Rural hamlets with goats wandering the streets and without so much as an art gallery were hardly his scene. However, the promise of €8 million and having his name attached to something greater than a hereditary lord's summer house were too appealing to pass up. As the two men shook hands, Jean-Paul looked up at the pasque flowers and felt a knot in his stomach that he told himself was excitement. Jean-Paul Duval travelled with a single-minded restlessness, stopping when the whim took him, staying only as long in one place as it took to harvest its skills, knowledge, and recipes. Then he would move on, ignoring the sense that he was leaving fallow fields behind and carrying forward hollow victories. Other than the chefs he obsessively researched, using the patchy Wi-Fi and cheap roadside motels, he met no one, spoke to no one. The weather in a place, its history, its natural beauty mattered little to him. He was driven by a single, uncompromisable objective. He must restore his name. He drank fresh yak milk in a yurt on the Mongolian steppe, ate deep-fried chili crickets on a beach in Mexico and raw sea cucumber in Japan. He learned to wrap meat in banana leaves and cook it underground in a hangi with Maoris in New Zealand. Made sweet rice inside hollow bamboo in Thailand, and hot cauliflower ice cream with a chemist-turned-chef in Copenhagen. Nearly a year to the day after leaving the tiny mountain town, Duval was exploring the spices of a souk on the Algerian Sea when his phone rang unexpectedly with a call from Watson, announcing that the restaurant was almost complete. Jean-Paul turned his back on the fragrant market and walked with a hurried determination through the brightly painted cobbled lanes to his hostel in the old quarter. His thirst for knowledge in the past year had been unquenchable, and he knew that he had reached a dizzying level of ability. He was ready. The familiar shake of the old Citroën as it bumped along the corrugated mountain road toward the restaurant usually relaxed Jean-Paul. The white noise of the car's tyres across the gravel let him focus on the day ahead, planning his menu, briefing his staff, touring the kitchen to ensure everything was just the way he liked it. Today, though, his hands gripped the juddering steering wheel until his knuckles were white. Many times, he narrowly avoided going over the sheer cliff edge because his eyes were scanning the peaks above him. Where was it? He thought he would have seen it by now. Duval drew his breath as he approached the final mountain tunnel that would bring him to the plateau where the restaurant had been nestled for nearly 100 years. In place of the shingled roof and cheerful painted eaves, a long white rectangle with a steep glass roof set at a displaced angle jutted out over the precipice. At a distance, the colour and angles had made it almost indistinguishable from the harsh, snow-covered peaks surrounding it. When Duval parked the clunky red van outside, it looked comically out of place against the precision-cut walls of the building. Philippe Watson-Jones was waiting for him, leaning casually against the enormous steel doorframe, in his black turtleneck and swirling a generous glass of Merlot in one hand. An archetypal architect, thought Jean-Paul, and a smug-looking one at that. Watson stretched his arms wide as Duval stepped out of the van. "The prodigal son returns!" Jean-Paul felt his heart rate quicken as he stepped towards the place that had been his second home, his school, his refuge for nearly 50 years. "Come, come," urged Watson. "I do think you're going to love it." He took Duval by the elbow and steered him proudly into the new restaurant. Jean-Paul blinked as he stepped inside. Everything, absolutely everything, was white. The maitre d's desk, the bar, the tables and chairs were all high-gloss white polymer. The walls were bright white, devoid of any art or design. The only decoration was a near life-sized elephant's head above the bar, also in glossy white plastic. Watson noticed the chef's gaze drift to the elephant. "Do you like it, old chap? It's a nod to Hannibal, that other lesser-known conqueror of the Alps. I thought it rather clever." Duval nodded, slowly. Only the floors were a dark slate that echoed the two men's footsteps as they crossed the cavernous space, Philippe Watson-Jones still grasping the chef's elbow. A sudden thought struck Duval. "Watson, where are the windows?" "Aha!" laughed the architect. "My pièce de résistance. Look up." Jean-Paul did as he was instructed and saw the looming peaks of the mountains tilting towards him through the slanted glass ceiling, their angles bizarrely distorted, as if in a funhouse mirror. As if reading his mind, Watson broke into his thoughts. "I used mirrors to create the leaning effect. Do you like it?" Not pausing for an answer, he continued. "This restaurant is all about you, JP. Your skills, your talents, your haute cuisine. I removed the windows because we don't want diners to be distracted. Your food engages all the senses, and that's where the attention should be. Your chef-d'oeuvre." Jean-Paul cringed inadvertently at the heavy Oxbridge accent that distorted the French. Watson didn't seem to notice. "The only ordinary windows are in the bathrooms, les pissoirs. I thought it was an amusing little touch. Your guests can urinate with the finest views in the region." Duval tried to laugh, but the sound came out more like a gargle. Jean-Paul had never set foot inside a university. He knew nothing of Le Corbusier or Lloyd Wright, Bauhaus or functionalism. His formal schooling had ended when he was 14 years old and had taken on a formal apprenticeship under his father's tutelage. He knew that there was much he did not know, unlike the erudite architect. And yet he couldn't help but wonder whether his new restaurant, so chic and white and sparse, with its enormous elephant's head, may possibly be just a little bit ridiculous. JP, ventured Watson, as he turned his back on the chef to pour another glass of Merlot at the bar. "We do need to talk about the bill." Jean-Paul turned to look at his petite acquaintance, who was now perched, childlike, on one of the high white bar stools. He waited, saying nothing. "Well, the thing is, you see, it did come up a tad more than we talked about. You know, what with a difficult location and needing to secure expert contractors and whatnot. It's probably, well, not too much more. And really, when you think about it, small change compared with what this place will bring in now. So I think 12.6 million is quite reasonable, actually." He rushed out the final words and quickly buried his nose in the Merlot. Jean-Paul looked at the small man and around at the medicinal space he found himself in. It suddenly felt like an asylum. He felt a hard knot form deep in his bowels and begin to fill his whole digestive system. Initially, he had trouble labelling this feeling, and then it struck him. Rage. His heritage, the welcoming auberge built and tended with love by his forebears, had been replaced with a solitary confinement chamber where city-dwelling guests would piss on his beloved Alps, and he was being sent bankrupt for the privilege. He turned, unsmiling, to face Watson. "Very well, Watson. I will arrange it. But now I think I should spend some time in my kitchen." The architect slid elegantly from the high stool, leaving his half-finished wine on the shimmering white bar. "Of course, mon ami, of course. I will leave you to make yourself at home. I really do think it's going to be a raging success, JP. I spoke with Emma Thompson last week, and she simply begged me for an invitation to your opening night." He headed for the oversized door that dwarfed his slight frame, his leather-soled shoes clip-clapping across the hard slate floor. "Watson," called Duval, and the architect turned. "How much was the elephant?" Philippe Watson-Jones laughed. "Oh, my dear friend, you don't want to know." Slowly, Jean-Paul Duval rounded the bar and stepped into his new kitchen. He breathed a sigh of relief. At least in here there was soul. The room was enormous, with more than enough stations for several sous chefs. He ran his hand thoughtfully along the stainless steel counters as he explored the space. There was no denying it. Watson-Jones had done well here. The room flowed perfectly from the prep areas to the line, and the equipment was of the highest grade. An enormous refrigerator and freezer took up nearly an entire wall. There were multiple sinks for preparing food and washing dishes. A triple-width range would allow several chefs to cook at the same time, and the mixers, slicers, and utensils had all been perfectly arranged. On the far wall, resting almost unnoticed on a counter all to itself, was his grandfather's meat grinder. Made of heavy-duty steel, it was hand-operated, and Duval recalled countless hours of skinning and gutting the wild boar and venison that he and his grandfather had hunted in the valley. He recalled the pain in his adolescent right arm from forcing hundreds of kilograms of gamey flesh and gristle through the machine, sweat pouring from his brow, as the young apprentice learned how to master the creation of the sausages that the restaurant had become so famous for. His grandfather had insisted that even the bones be ground into the mix, adamant that the marrow was the secret ingredient that made his boudin noir so celebrated. Duval rested his hand lovingly on the grinder. His grandfather, and then his father, had refused to purchase an electric model, insisting that for authentic mountain flavour, only hand-ground meat would do. The master chef that the young apprentice had become agreed. He was glad Watson hadn't discarded the machine. Duval was nervous. It was opening night, and he was making the final rounds of his kitchen, ensuring everything was in place, ready to start turning out 12 impeccably curated courses. This would be his one big opportunity to showcase not only the building that he had chosen to describe as extraordinary, but his new, more refined style, still regionally focused, but different from anything he had done before. He was no longer a chef paysan. He was a maestro, a savant of the kitchen. He paused at the antique meat grinder, placed his hand on the last remaining piece of his family history, and drew a deep breath. Soon, faces that he had only ever seen on the covers of magazines would be stepping through the industrial steel doorframe and into this stark white space, which Philippe Watson-Jones had arranged for GQ magazine to call achingly hip. Guests would be greeted with a local sparkling Chardonnay and an amuse-bouche of which Duval was particularly proud. A miniature ball of wild sage sorbet, at the centre of which they would be surprised and delighted by a candied duck's tongue. Each course to follow was a further demonstration of the chef's mastery of his craft. Raw trout morsels topped with whipped caviar mayonnaise on a trout skin cracker that dissolved on the tongue. Cheek of venison smoked in native black pine. Wild boar trotters filled with a walnut and cognac mousse. And, of course, a unique take on the boudin noir, Chez Duval's signature blood sausages, in a nod to his grandfather's legacy. Watson himself had come a few days early at Duval's request, making sure that every nook and cranny of the building was up to scratch. It was important to the chef that he put things to rest with the architect. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been made a fool of, and he didn't want to risk bitterness and resentment poisoning his art on opening night. They had sat together at the bar the night before, talking intently before taking a final tour of the restaurant. And Watson Jones had expounded at length about the importance of humour in architecture. In fact, he explained, Architectural Digest had just recently noted that it may become a defining feature of postmodern construction. So much so that some were already referring to this as the humorist period. Duval was sceptical, but the conversation had cemented his resolve to put his anger behind him. The opening night was a glittering success. Actors, politicians, sports stars, and the semi-royal cast-offs that float across Europe with a gift for sniffing out upscale launches circulated in the cavernous space, kissing cheeks, drinking too much champagne, and praising each course more loudly than the last. Jean-Paul ignored the loud demands for a speech that would occasionally float across the clamour of the crowd, intent on ensuring that every dish that left his kitchen was nothing short of perfection. Towards the end of the evening, a busboy nervously poked his head around the kitchen door. "Chef? I'm so sorry, Chef, but a guest. Her name is Emma Thompson. She is asking where Monsieur Watson is." Duval was putting the final touches on the last dessert course for the evening. Delicate droplets of wild-picked blackberry coulis on a miniature blue cheese panna cotta, and flinging the finished plates towards the waiting servers. The placement of each drop was a matter of fine art. Without looking up, he barked, "How should I know? There are 200 people out there. Tell her to look for herself." As the photographers snapped their final frames, and Jean-Paul closed the enormous door behind the last guest, he breathed a sigh of relief. It had all gone according to plan. It was a glorious day in late March, as Jean-Paul Duval sat at the White Polymer restaurant bar, anxiously awaiting the post. Despite the chill in the air, he had propped the enormous front door of the restaurant open, so he could see the mountains beyond. The sun was beginning to drop behind the snow-covered peaks, casting them in a soft golden glow that deepened with each passing hour. At last he saw the speck of the postman's van, slowly winding up the treacherous mountain road, and he stepped quickly onto the doorstep to watch his arrival, shivering in his thin chef's coat. The little van slid in and out of view as it rounded each hairpin turn, until it pulled up with a crunch on the gravel road outside the restaurant, and the weathered little postman stepped out. "Is it here?" asked Duval. "Yes, it's here," Marco replied, reaching quickly into his worn leather satchel to hand Jean-Paul a thick envelope, with its grinning cartoon tyre man waving from the top left corner. Hurriedly, the chef tore open the letter. Could it be right? His hands were shaking so much it was hard to get the words on the page to stand still. He read it again, more slowly this time, to be sure. And there it was in front of him, plain for all to see. He leapt down from the step and threw his arms around the postman, kissing him on both cheeks. 3 stars. 3. All his, each one fought for as if his life depended on it. He wasn't ashamed that Marco saw his cheeks glistening as they pulled apart, and he clapped the little mountain man on the shoulder, nodding. Having sent the old postman home with a case of his best champagne, he returned to the restaurant and resumed his seat at the bar to read the letter at leisure. As usual, it came with the review that would be published in that year's Michelin guide. Nestled in the high Alps like an eagle's eyrie, Chez Duval has earned a reputation as towering as the mountains that surround it. Owner-chef Jean-Paul Duval recently took a hiatus to renovate the restaurant and refine his craft, and the decision has most certainly paid off. The exceptional new structure is on its own worth braving the hair-raising mountain road for, but the cuisine is simply unmissable for any sophisticated diner. Locally sourced ingredients are given astonishing new life by a chef that has taken his father's legacy and elevated it to a fine art. The Michelin guide recommends the duck egg and black bass crepes and the poached chicken in genepi broth. But purists of Rhône-Alpes cuisine will not be able to look past the humorist-style architectural boudin noir, lovingly made by hand with an antique meat grinder that has been in the chef's family for generations. "Well, Hannibal," said Duval, raising his glass towards the enormous plastic elephant's head hanging above his bar. "I'm back." The end.